Now take a deep breath and let yourself relax. Close your eyes and imagine the golden age of Rome. Tonight, I'll take you to the time of Julius Caesar, to the quiet yet magnificent moments of history. The city of Rome, in the final century before the birth of Christ, was a place both magnificent and troubled. Its marble temples glistened in the sunlight. Its bustling markets rang with the voices of thousands, and its narrow streets carried the scent of bread, wine, and smoke. Yet beneath this dazzling surface, the Roman Republic trembled under the weight of ambition, inequality, and endless conflict. It was in this restless, fragile world that Julius Caesar was born, and to understand his rise, one must first understand the Rome that shaped him. Rome of the late Republic was a city of contrasts. By the year 100 BC, it had already become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. From Spain in the west to Asia Minor in the east, Roman influence stretched across vast lands. Its legions had conquered Carthage, subdued Greece, and established provinces from Gaul to Syria. The victories of generals had brought unimaginable wealth into the city, gold from the east, slaves from every corner, spices, silks, and exotic animals. Senators returned from campaigns as wealthy men, their estates swelling with riches. The Forum, once a modest gathering place, now gleamed with new basilicas and temples paid for by conquest. But prosperity was not shared equally. The aristocratic class, the optimates, grew ever richer, while the ordinary citizens, the plebeians, crowded into cramped apartments called insulae, sometimes no more than wooden shacks stacked high above the streets. Fires were frequent, sanitation poor, and disease common. Grain had to be imported in massive quantities to feed the growing population, and unrest simmered whenever shortages struck. Rome's greatness, in truth, rested on fragile foundations. Daily life in the late Republic carried a rhythm shaped by politics, religion, and survival. For the wealthy, mornings began in grand townhouses, where slaves attended to every need. Patrons received their clients, ordinary men who depended on the favor of the rich for food, work, or protection. Politics, in Rome, was not confined to the Senate. It unfolded on every street corner, in every forum, and even in whispered conversations at dinner tables. An ambitious man could rise through clever alliances and public favor, but ambition also made enemies. The Senate still stood as the central governing body, but its authority was increasingly contested. The assemblies of the people had grown in importance, especially as leaders like the Gracchi brothers had pushed for land reforms decades earlier. Their violent deaths, however, had revealed a dangerous truth. Violence had become a tool of politics in Rome. By Caesar's time, assassination, street riots, and the bribery of voters were common instruments of power. Religion infused daily life as well. Romans believed the gods guided the state, and every decision, whether declaring war, passing a law, or setting out on a journey, required omens and sacrifices. Yet this too had become entangled with politics. Priests often served as senators, and auguries were used as excuses to delay or advance political decisions. To understand Rome before Caesar is to see a society where sacred and secular were inseparably bound. The army, too, was undergoing transformation. In earlier times, Roman soldiers were citizen farmers, men who owned land and served their city in times of war. But the Marian reforms, introduced around 107 BC, allowed the landless poor to enlist. Soldiers no longer fought merely for Rome. They fought for their generals, who promised them land, plunder, and pensions. Loyalty shifted from the Republic to the commanders, setting the stage for men like Sulla, Pompey, and ultimately Caesar himself to wield armies as private instruments of power. This change was perhaps the single most dangerous development of the late Republic, for it meant the Republic's fate could be decided not by laws, but by swords. The streets of Rome reflected this tension. Crowds gathered to hear speeches in the forum, but they could also turn violent in an instant. Rival gangs, funded by politicians, patrolled neighborhoods, intimidating voters and attacking opponents. One of the most notorious leaders of these gangs was Publius Clodius Pulcher, whose mobs terrorized the city in the very years of Caesar's rise. Order seemed always fragile, threatened by factionalism. And yet, Rome was also a place of wonder. The aqueducts brought fresh water to fountains and baths, theaters echoed with the works of Plautus and Terence, philosophers from Greece lectured in shaded gardens. The city's people were deeply pragmatic, proud of their traditions but open to absorbing the cultures of those they conquered. Greek art, literature, and ideas mingled with Roman discipline and law, creating a cultural richness that defined the age. Amid this mixture of grandeur and decay, opportunity and danger, Julius Caesar would soon step forward. But before his name was known, before his legions carried Rome's banner to new frontiers, Rome itself was already caught in the storm of change. Senators plotted in marble halls, merchants counted their profits in busy markets, soldiers dreamed of land and glory. And the common people struggled to find bread and safety in the shadows of towering temples. The story of Julius Caesar's youth begins not with the roar of battle, nor with the marble splendor of Rome's Senate, but with a family name, a household filled with tradition, and a young man growing into a world of ambition. Caesar was born in July of the year 100 BC, during a sweltering Roman summer, into the distinguished but not supremely powerful gens Julia. The Julians claimed descent from the goddess Venus at least. That was the tradition the family proudly repeated, and while modern ears may treat such stories as myth, in ancient Rome these claims carried weight. They shaped reputations, bolstered prestige, and gave a young boy like Caesar the sense that he was destined for something greater. Caesar's father, Gaius Julius Caesar, was a man of modest political career, serving as governor of the province of Asia. His mother, Aurelia, came from a well-respected family and was known for her intelligence and dignity. Many historians credit Aurelia with shaping Caesar's early character, while his father died when Caesar was only 16. His mother remained a guiding force throughout his formative years. In the Roman household, mothers could wield surprising influence, especially when their sons were ambitious and still untested. Rome, in those days, was a city in turmoil. The Republic was shaken by factionalism, with the Optimates, the conservative senators who defended aristocratic privilege, clashing constantly with the Populares, who sought to advance the interests of the people. These were not formal political parties, but shifting alliances of powerful men, and they fought with rhetoric in the Senate, but also with mobs in the streets. Caesar's family leaned toward the Populares. His uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, was one of the most celebrated generals of his day, a man who had reformed the Roman army and held the consulship a record 7 times. Through Marius, Caesar inherited both a political alignment and a legacy of ambition. As a boy, Caesar would have been surrounded by the sounds of Rome, the chants of sellers in the markets, the hammering of builders raising new temples, the debates echoing in the forum. His education, though, was more disciplined than noisy. Like many Roman aristocrats, Caesar studied rhetoric, literature, and philosophy. He read Greek as well as Latin, for Greek culture was considered the height of refinement. Homer, Plato, and Aristotle filled his mind, while Roman authors trained him in the art of oratory, the single most important skill for any aspiring politician. Words were weapons in Rome, and Caesar learned early how to use them. By his late teens, Caesar was already known for his confidence and charm. He was tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes. Ancient writers noted his elegance, his careful grooming, his polished dress, and while some mocked him for vanity, these traits made him stand out in the crowded world of Roman politics. Appearances mattered in Rome, A man who commanded attention before he spoke already held an advantage. Yet ambition was dangerous. Rome was in the midst of bloody rivalries. When Caesar was a teenager, his uncle Marius was engaged in a bitter struggle with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, another powerful general who represented the Optimates. The conflict culminated in civil war. Sulla marched his armies on Rome, an unprecedented act. And for a time Caesar's family was marked as enemies. Caesar himself was ordered to divorce his wife, Cornelia, daughter of a Marian ally. He refused. For that act of defiance, Sulla confiscated his property and placed him under threat of death. Only through the intervention of friends and relatives did the young Caesar escape execution. The story goes that Sulla, relenting, remarked, "In this boy are many Mariuses," a recognition that Caesar's potential for ambition and disruption was vast. Exiled from Rome for his safety, Caesar began to see the wider world. He joined the army and served in Asia Minor and Cilicia, where he distinguished himself in battle. In one campaign, he fought with such bravery that he was awarded the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors. The crown was made of oak leaves and given only to a man who had saved the life of a fellow citizen in combat. To earn it at such a young age was a sign of his courage and his hunger for recognition. These years of danger and wandering tested him. Far from Rome, Caesar learned the discipline of a soldier, the patience of command, and the precariousness of fortune. Yet he never abandoned his ambition for political power, even while serving abroad. He studied rhetoric under masters, refining his voice and his skill with language. When the storms of Sulla's dictatorship finally passed and it was safe to return, Caesar came back to Rome not merely as a survivor, but as a man already seasoned by hardship. Back in Rome, he began the slow climb of the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices that structured a Roman politician's career. First came minor posts, then higher magistracies. Success required both money and connections, and Caesar, never particularly wealthy, relied heavily on loans. Friends and patrons supported him, gambling that his charm and energy would one day bring rewards. Debt was a constant shadow. But Caesar accepted it as the price of ambition. Better to owe, he might have thought, than to be forgotten. What set Caesar apart, even in his youth, was his refusal to be ordinary. Many young nobles aspired to office, but few possessed his blend of daring and charisma. He knew how to charm the common people, how to impress the Senate, and how to endure the hostility of enemies without bending. He was bold enough to resist Sulla, daring enough to win honors in battle, and skilled enough to rise quickly when fortune allowed. Rome was a city overflowing with ambitious men, but already whispers suggested that Julius Caesar was unlike the rest. This was the foundation of his life, a youth marked by danger, resilience, and unshakable ambition. The boy who had once been threatened with death by a dictator would, in time, become dictator himself. But for now, he was still climbing, step by step, onto the stage of history. By the late 60s BC, Julius Caesar had risen from a precarious young noble, burdened with debts and political enemies, to one of the most promising leaders of Rome. Through alliances, charm, and sheer daring, he had climbed the ranks of the cursus honorum. By 59 BC, he was consul, the highest elected office of the Republic, sharing power with Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, though history remembers that year not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but simply as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Bibulus, sidelined and humiliated, had retreated into private life, leaving Caesar the stage. When his consulship ended, Caesar sought more than a quiet retirement or a provincial governorship. He desired command, an arena in which ambition could burn brighter than the marble of the Forum. His prize was Gaul, a vast and settled region beyond the Alps, populated by Celtic tribes, rich in land and constantly in turmoil. Appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, Caesar gained authority over legions. It was here, among forests, rivers, and tribal confederations, that he would carve his name into history. Gaul was no simple province. It was a patchwork of tribes, some wealthy and urbanized, others wild and fiercely independent. They traded with Rome, but resisted Roman control. Caesar's opportunity came swiftly. In 58 BC, the Helvetii, a tribe from what is now Switzerland, began a mass migration westward. Their movement threatened Rome's allies and raised fears of destabilization. Caesar, ever eager for glory, marched to intercept. At the Battle of Bibrecht, Caesar's legions clashed with the Helvetii. Ancient sources, especially Caesar's own commentary De Bello Gallico commentaries on the Gallic War, describe how his disciplined troops outmaneuvered the mass of migrating warriors. Though vastly outnumbered, Roman training and discipline prevailed. The Helvetii were crushed, and their survivors forced back to their homeland. For Rome, this was a victory of order over chaos. For Caesar, it was the beginning of legend. But Gaul was not pacified. Soon after, Caesar confronted Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine with his people and established himself as a power among the Gallic tribes. At first, diplomacy was attempted, but negotiations broke down. Caesar's narrative depicts Ariovistus as arrogant and threatening, though modern historians suggest Caesar deliberately painted him as a menace to justify his own war. Regardless, when the two forces met near the Vosges Mountains, Rome triumphed again. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, his dreams of dominion shattered. Caesar's reputation in Rome soared. He was no longer merely an ambitious politician but a commander of destiny. The years that followed turned Gaul into Caesar's canvas. He subdued tribe after tribe, the Belgae in the north, praised even by Caesar as the bravest of all the Gauls, the Veneti, masters of the sea in Brittany, whose fleet Caesar defeated in a daring naval battle, and countless smaller groups who either allied with Rome or were crushed resisting. Each campaign enriched his soldiers with plunder and bound them closer to him personally. They were no longer just legions of Rome, they were Caesar's legions. One of the most dramatic episodes came in 55 BC, when Caesar sought to demonstrate Rome's power beyond Gaul. He built a massive bridge across the Rhine, an engineering marvel completed in just 10 days. With this bridge, his legions marched briefly into Germanic territory, not to conquer but to intimidate. After a show of strength, Caesar withdrew and destroyed the bridge, sending a message: Rome could cross any boundary, even nature's greatest rivers, whenever it pleased. The symbolism was immense. Caesar was not merely defending Rome's borders, he was expanding the very concept of Roman reach. That same year, Caesar did something even bolder. He invaded Britain. Though the island was unknown and mysterious to Romans, its tribes had supported resistance in Gaul. Caesar's expeditions in 55 and 54 BC were limited, more reconnaissance than conquest. But they carried enormous prestige. He was the first Roman general to cross the English Channel, and though storms and logistical challenges prevented lasting occupation, the image of Caesar's legions on the shores of a distant, fog-covered island captured imaginations in Rome. He had made the edge of the known world a stage for his ambition. Yet Gaul resisted fiercely. In 52 BC, under the leadership of a young chieftain named Vercingetorix, the tribes united in revolt. Vercingetorix proved a brilliant commander, adopting scorched earth tactics to deny the Roman supplies and striking where Caesar was weakest. For a time, it seemed Caesar might lose all he had gained. His enemies in Rome, jealous of his growing power, waited eagerly for news of disaster. But Caesar's genius lay in endurance as much as aggression. The climax came at the fortress of Alasia, There, Vercingetorix and his army were besieged by Caesar. Yet as Caesar's legions encircled the town, a massive relief army of Gauls arrived, threatening to trap the Romans between two enemies. It was a moment of supreme crisis. Caesar ordered a second line of fortifications, facing outward, so his legions were surrounded by walls both enclosing Alasia and defending against the relief force. For days, ferocious battles raged. The Romans, outnumbered, held firm. In the end, discipline and engineering triumphed. The relief army broke, and Vercingetorix surrendered, his dramatic submission laying down his arms at Caesar's feet became a symbol of Gaul's defeat. The conquest of Gaul was complete. After nearly a decade of campaigns, Caesar had transformed a patchwork of tribes into Roman territory. His legions had marched from the Atlantic to the Rhine, from the Alps to the Channel. He had subdued millions, killed or enslaved countless thousands, and enriched both Rome and himself beyond measure. More importantly, he had forged an army utterly loyal to him personally. Back in Rome, his enemies watched with dread. They saw not just a general but a man whose victories had made him too powerful, too admired, and too rich to be controlled. The conquest of Gaul was not merely a military triumph, it was the foundation of civil war. For Caesar, it had all been worth it. He had written his own account, the commentaries, presenting himself as a rational, just, and brilliant commander. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also masterful literature. Romans read his words and believed him a hero. His soldiers followed him with devotion. His rivals whispered of tyranny. And thus, as Gaul fell silent under Roman rule, the seeds of Rome's greatest conflict were being sown. Caesar's star blazed brighter than ever, but already shadows gathered in the Republic he was destined to change forever. By the early 50s BC, Julius Caesar stood at the height of his fame and power. The conquest of Gaul had given him riches beyond measure, and the loyalty of hardened veterans who had followed him through forests, across rivers, and into countless battles. His victories had thrilled the Roman people, who celebrated him as a hero, while his enemies in the Senate viewed him with suspicion and dread. Caesar was no longer just a general. He was a force that threatened to reshape the very balance of the Republic. In Rome, politics had become poisonous. The first triumvirate, an informal alliance between Caesar, Pompeius Magnus, and Marcus Crassus, had once dominated the Republic, but alliances born of convenience seldom last. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had sought military glory to match his wealth. His disastrous campaign against the Parthians ended in 53 BC with his death at Carrhae. The triumvirate was broken. Pompeius, once Caesar's ally and even his son-in-law, had begun to drift away. His marriage tie to Caesar ended with the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter, in childbirth. Without that bond, suspicion grew. Pompeius had once been the darling of the people, a celebrated general who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and expanded Roman territory in the east. But Caesar's dazzling conquests in Gaul overshadowed even Pompeius' glory. Pride and rivalry began to erode their friendship. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's popularity and the loyalty of his armies, found in Pompeius a counterweight. Many senators, especially the conservative faction known as the Optimates, despised Caesar's rise. They believed he had accumulated too much power, disregarded tradition, and threatened the Republic itself. For years, they had tolerated him because of his victories. But now, with Gaul subdued and Caesar's command nearing its legal expiration, they saw a chance to curb him. At the heart of the conflict was the question of what would happen when Caesar's governorship ended. Roman law required generals to relinquish command of their armies before standing for re-election to high office. To enter Rome at the head of legions was illegal, a threat of tyranny. Caesar knew that if he returned as a private citizen, Stripped of his imperium, his enemies would prosecute him for corruption and crimes committed during his consulship. He could lose not only his career but his freedom. Even his life. Caesar wanted the right to stand for consul in absentia, maintaining his command until the election. His enemies in the Senate refused. They demanded that he disband his legions and return to Rome as a civilian. To comply was to expose himself to ruin. To resist was to risk civil war. The Senate, under Pompeius' influence, passed an ultimatum. Caesar must lay down his arms. Caesar responded with calm but firm words, reminding them of his service and victories for Rome. He argued that he sought only fairness, that if he must disarm, so too should Pompeius, who also commanded legions near Rome. The Senate rejected his proposal. War seemed inevitable. In January of 49 BC, the Senate declared a state of emergency and gave Pompeius extraordinary powers to defend the Republic. Pompeius boasted that he could raise legions simply by stamping his foot on the ground. Many believed Caesar would hesitate, that he would compromise to preserve peace. But Caesar's ambitions were too great, and his situation too precarious. He knew that to surrender was to perish. The choice was stark: obey and be destroyed, or defy and seize destiny. The fateful moment came at the banks of the Rubicon, a small river that marked the boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper. To cross it with his army was an act of treason, a declaration of war against the Senate and the Republic. Ancient sources tell us that Caesar paused, aware of the enormity of the decision. He weighed the consequences not only for himself, but for Rome. To advance was to unleash civil war. To retreat was to abandon all he had won. Then, in words immortalized by history, he declared, "Alia acta state, the die is cast." With that, Caesar led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. The act was both symbolic and real. No turning back remained. The Republic trembled. News raced ahead of him. Panic gripped Rome. Senators fled the city, many siding with Pompeius, who withdrew south to gather forces. Caesar, advancing swiftly and with little resistance, found Italy opening its gates. Cities welcomed him, not with fear, but with support. For many common people, Caesar represented opportunity, reform, and relief from the arrogance of the Senate elite. In those early months of 49 BC, the civil war began not with great battles, but with a contest of speed and loyalty. Pompeius and his allies retreated, choosing to regroup in Greece where they could draw on the resources of Rome's eastern provinces. Caesar, meanwhile, secured Italy with remarkable efficiency. His legions, battle-hardened from Gaul, marched with confidence. Town after town submitted. Within weeks, Caesar stood unopposed in Rome itself. Yet victory was far from complete. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, but the true war lay ahead. Pompeius commanded vast resources, a navy, and legions loyal to him. The Senate, though scattered, still had legitimacy. The Republic was divided, brother against brother, friend against friend. The choice Caesar had made at the Rubicon would plunge Rome into years of bloodshed. But for Caesar, it was the only choice. Better to seize power through war than to submit to humiliation in peace. The Republic that had once prided itself on shared governance now stood at the brink of monarchy and civil strife. The river had been crossed, the die cast. The fate of Rome was no longer in the hands of the Senate, nor even of Pompeius, but in the iron will of one man who had dared to march where none before him had dared. After crossing the Rubicon, Julius Caesar entered Italy not with a chaotic army, but with disciplined legions whose loyalty was absolute. The city of Rome itself, long accustomed to the authority of the Senate and the pomp of traditional magistrates, found its streets filled with banners of Caesar's 13th Legion. Citizens and soldiers alike observed a general who had conquered Gaul, who had faced tribes, storms, and rivers. now moving through their very homes. Yet he did not march recklessly. He sought order, not anarchy. Caesar's first priority was securing the city and neutralizing Pompey's supporters in Italy, senators who had fled, and those hesitant to confront him. Were given a choice, swear allegiance to Caesar or leave. Many fled southward to join Pompeius in Greece or to rally forces in Spain. Caesar's approach to Rome was calculated. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed, understanding that the Republic was not a battlefield to be destroyed, but a society to be guided. Once Rome was stabilized, Caesar turned his attention westward. Spain Hispania was home to Pompeius' loyal legions and their commanders. These forces, veterans of past campaigns and bound by oaths of loyalty, posed the first real threat to Caesar's dominance beyond Italy. To ensure that his rear was secure and that Pompeius could not regroup, Caesar organized a swift campaign. The march to Spain was meticulous. Caesar's legions moved with precision, crossing rivers, skirting mountains, and setting up fortified camps each night. Logistics were as crucial as tactics. Supply lines had to be maintained, food secured for thousands of soldiers, and roads kept clear. Caesar personally oversaw every detail, from the distribution of rations to the placement of sentries. His presence inspired confidence. Men who had marched with him through Gallic forests now followed him with unwavering trust. At the city of Ilerda, modern-day Lydda, Caesar faced his first major opposition. Pompeius' legate, Afranius, and his colleague Petreius had fortified their positions, confident that the mountainous terrain favored defense, but Caesar's strategy relied on movement and adaptation. Rather than attacking head-on, he maneuvered around their positions, cutting off their supplies and establishing strong camps that surrounded the enemy. Days turned into tense weeks. The soldiers endured heat, hunger, and occasional skirmishes, yet Caesar's legions held firm, trusting their commander's plan. The encirclement eventually forced Afranius and Petreius to surrender. Caesar treated the defeated with a combination of firmness and clemency. Many of the captured soldiers were allowed to join his ranks, a pragmatic choice that bolstered his numbers while denying Pompeius reinforcements. Spain had been pacified, not merely conquered. Caesar's success in Spain sent shockwaves through the Roman world. He had demonstrated that speed, discipline, and strategic insight could overcome both terrain and loyal opposition. The Senate in Rome, scattered as it was, began to realize that Caesar's march was unstoppable. Pompeius, who had been assembling forces in Greece, now faced a general who had secured his home territory and eliminated immediate threats. Beyond military considerations, Caesar understood the importance of perception. He used letters, speeches, and propaganda to present his actions as measured and justified. He reminded Rome that he did not seek power for personal gain, but to protect the Republic from factionalism and chaos. The message resonated with common citizens who were weary of civil discord. Caesar appeared not as a tyrant, but as a necessary arbiter in a time of crisis. Meanwhile, his legions, well-fed, motivated, and confident, moved onward with purpose. Each march, each fortified camp, each successful negotiation strengthened Caesar's control. By the time he returned to Italy from Spain, his reputation as a commander of genius, a master of both diplomacy and warfare, was firmly established. The march to Spain also had a subtle but profound psychological effect. Soldiers came to believe that wherever Caesar led, victory would follow. His leadership style, combining strict discipline with personal attention to individual needs, created a bond that transcended fear or duty. Men fought not just for Rome, but for the men who had earned their loyalty through shared hardship, calculated risk, and visible competence. In retrospect, the campaign in Spain was more than a military operation. It was a demonstration of Caesar's vision of command, speed, adaptability, and human management proved as critical as swords and spears. By neutralizing Pompeius' forces there, Caesar ensured that the civil war would not be waged on Italian soil first, and that he could dictate the terms of engagement in the coming conflict. With Spain secure, Caesar returned to Rome, aware that the broader war with Pompeius and the Senate was still to come. Yet he had achieved what few thought possible. He had entered the city after crossing the Rubicon, neutralized immediate threats, and solidified the loyalty of his legions. The stage was set for a struggle that would determine the future of the Roman world. Following his decisive consolidation of Italy and the pacification of Spain, Julius Caesar set his eyes eastward. Pompeius, having gathered forces in Greece, posed the most immediate threat to Caesar's control over the Roman world. The stage was set for a campaign that would determine the fate of the Republic itself. Caesar understood that speed, strategy, and morale would be decisive. The march into Greece was not merely a movement of armies but a complex orchestration of logistics, diplomacy, and careful intelligence. Caesar's legions, seasoned by years in Gaul and the swift Spanish campaign, moved in disciplined columns across the Adriatic coastline. Ships ferried soldiers and supplies, while scouts charted the terrain and reported enemy positions. Every decision was calculated, every step deliberate. Caesar's leadership inspired confidence in men who had learned to trust his judgment through fire and hardship. Pompeius, confident in his larger forces and the loyalty of his eastern allies, awaited Caesar at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompeius' army was vast, numbering roughly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, and their encampments stretched across the fertile plains. Yet quantity alone could not compensate for lack of experience and unity. Caesar's force, smaller but tightly organized and cohesive, would soon demonstrate the power of discipline and innovative tactics. The night before battle, Caesar walked among his men. He reminded them of past victories, the forests of Gaul, the marches across Spain, the encirclement of Afrinius. He spoke of honor, duty, and the necessity of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Soldiers listened intently, drawing reassurance from the calm and calculated demeanor of their general. The tension was palpable, yet controlled, the calm before the storm. When the battle commenced, Pompeius initially attempted to use his cavalry superiority to envelop Caesar's forces. However, Caesar had anticipated this move. He had stationed hidden reserves of infantry and used the terrain strategically to neutralize the cavalry's advantage. The legions held their lines with unyielding discipline, their shields interlocked, their formations flawless. Hours of intense combat followed. The ground shook under the charge of horses. Dust rose in blinding clouds, and the sound of swords and shields rang out across the plains. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's forces advanced steadily, executing maneuvers that reflected both rigorous training and trust in their leader's strategic vision. At a critical moment, Caesar's hidden infantry reserves struck the flank of Pompeius' cavalry, breaking their formation and sending panic through the larger army. Once the cavalry was neutralized, the cohesion of Pompeius' infantry faltered. Chaos spread, and the battle turned decisively in Caesar's favor. By the end of the day, the majority of Pompeius' forces had either surrendered, fled, or been captured. Pompeius himself escaped to Egypt, seeking refuge but leaving his command shattered. The victory at Pharsalus was not merely a military triumph, it was a demonstration of Caesar's strategic genius and the psychological strength of his command. The myth of invincibility surrounding Caesar's legions was cemented. From the fertile plains of Thessaly, news of the triumph spread quickly throughout the Mediterranean world, shaking the confidence of those who opposed him and bolstering the morale of his supporters. Despite the glory, Caesar approached the aftermath with measured pragmatism. He treated prisoners with both justice and clemency. Understanding that reconciliation and strategic alliances were as crucial as victory on the battlefield, Rome itself was still divided, the Senate still fractured, and political challenges remained, yet with Pompeius' defeat in Greece, the most immediate military threat to Caesar's dominance had been neutralized. The campaign in Greece, culminating in the Battle of Pharsalus, marked a turning point. Caesar had demonstrated that disciplined, well-led, and loyal forces could overcome even numerically superior enemies. The Roman Republic, once thought immutable in its structures and traditions, now faced the reality of singular, decisive leadership. The die that Caesar had cast at the Rubicon was now fully in motion, and the path toward ultimate power was being paved with every calculated march and every decisive engagement. After his decisive victory at Pharsalus, Julius Caesar turned his attention to the east once more. Pompeius had fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. However, the political situation in Egypt was complex. The Ptolemaic dynasty was divided, and the young ruler was engaged in a bitter struggle with his sister, Cleopatra, over control of the throne. Caesar's arrival in Egypt was not just a pursuit of a fleeing enemy, it became a delicate diplomatic mission. The Roman general understood that military might alone would not secure lasting influence. He needed allies, insight into the local politics, and careful negotiation to ensure that Egypt could be brought under Rome's indirect control, without unnecessary destruction. The Nile, with its winding channels and fertile banks, provided both a natural highway and a challenge. Caesar carefully coordinated his landing and troop movements, ensuring that his forces were supplied and that any resistance could be contained. The citizens of Alexandria observed the Roman army with curiosity and apprehension. Caesar was both conqueror and statesman, balancing firmness with diplomacy. Cleopatra, a young queen with sharp intellect and awareness of the precariousness of her situation, quickly recognized the opportunity. She presented herself to Caesar as a legitimate claimant to the throne, advocating her cause with both tact and determination. Their meeting, carried out in secrecy and with careful planning, laid the foundation for her restoration to power. Caesar recognized her potential as an ally, understanding that a stable Egypt aligned with Rome's interests was preferable to prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, Ptolemy XIII's forces resisted. Skirmishes and strategic maneuvers unfolded along the streets and canals of Alexandria. Caesar's legions, disciplined and experienced, executed calculated strikes, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed while targeting the most strategic positions. The combination of military precision and diplomatic acumen gradually turned the tide. Within weeks, Cleopatra was reinstated as co-ruler alongside her younger brother, with Caesar's backing ensuring that the throne was secure. Egypt, while maintaining its internal structures, now had a Roman protectorate influence, stabilizing the region for trade, diplomacy, and strategic control. Caesar's intervention was remembered not for destruction, but for decisive action that combined military skill with careful statesmanship. The campaign in Egypt demonstrated Caesar's understanding that true power often comes from a blend of force, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. By supporting Cleopatra, he ensured that Rome could exercise influence in the eastern Mediterranean without the devastation that a purely martial campaign might have caused. With Egypt stabilized and the young queen restored, Caesar was able to consolidate his gains and turn his attention back to Rome. The eastern Mediterranean, a vital hub of commerce and culture, was now under the watchful eyes of Rome. And Caesar had positioned himself as a general capable not only of conquest, but of judicious governance. The Egyptian campaign was thus not a tale of extravagance or romance, but of careful planning, strategic foresight, and the complex interplay between military action and political negotiation. It solidified Caesar's reputation as a commander who could navigate both the battlefield and the intricacies of international politics. After the successful Egyptian campaign, Julius Caesar returned to Rome with a reputation that had grown to almost legendary proportions. The city he had left behind after crossing the Rubicon had been in turmoil, its senate fractured, and its citizens wary. Yet Caesar's return was not marked by chaos or unrestrained triumph. Instead, he approached the city with the same methodical attention to order that had defined his military campaigns. Rome had changed during his absence. Political factions scrambled to regain influence, many senators had taken sides in the previous conflicts, and the public watched anxiously, aware that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Caesar understood that mere military victories were not enough to secure lasting authority. He needed to stabilize the city, consolidate power, and guide the republic in a way that maintained both control and legitimacy. His first actions upon returning were deliberate. Caesar implemented reforms designed to address long-standing grievances and restore confidence in governance. He restructured the calendar, creating what would become the Julian calendar, aligning the year more accurately with the solar cycle. This seemingly administrative change had profound implications, demonstrating that Caesar's vision extended beyond the battlefield into the rhythms of daily Roman life. Equally important were his social and political reforms. Caesar reduced debts, provided land for veterans, and granted citizenship to communities that had long been marginalized. These actions strengthened loyalty among the populace and the army, creating a broader base of support that was rooted not merely in fear but in gratitude and trust. Rome, a city that had long been wary of concentrated power, began to accept his authority as a stabilizing force rather than a threat. Yet opposition remained. Many senators, particularly those aligned with the Optimates, resented Caesar's growing power and influence. They feared that the traditional republican structures were being eroded. In response, Caesar maintained a careful balance between firmness and conciliation. He met with political leaders, listened to their concerns, and offered compromises when possible. His approach was both strategic and symbolic. He sought to maintain the appearance of republican governance while ensuring that real control rested firmly in his hands. Caesar's consolidation of power also involved military considerations. He retained command of his legions, ensuring that the army's loyalty remained unwavering. These forces were stationed in strategic locations throughout Italy, ready to respond to unrest or rebellion. The presence of disciplined, battle-hardened troops acted as both a deterrent to potential adversaries and a reassurance to citizens who feared civil instability. During this period, Caesar also turned his attention to Rome's provinces by reorganizing administration, appointing loyal governors, and implementing fair taxation policies. He strengthened Rome's control over distant territories. These reforms had long-term consequences, solidifying trade routes, improving infrastructure, and increasing the efficiency of governance across the Republic. Caesar's influence now extended not only through military might but through bureaucratic skill and thoughtful administration. Amid these actions, Caesar was acutely aware of the symbolic aspects of power. Public ceremonies, triumphs, and civic rituals were conducted with careful attention to tradition, signaling continuity even amid profound change. By balancing innovation with respect for Rome's historical norms, Caesar reinforced his legitimacy and presented himself as a leader capable of uniting the city and its far-flung territories. Despite the stability he achieved, the path to singular authority was not uncontested. Factions within the Senate conspired, plotted, and debated how to counteract Caesar's influence. Yet each attempt to resist was met with careful calculation, political negotiation, or, when necessary, decisive action. Caesar's skill lay not only in his military genius but in his ability to anticipate, understand, and neutralize threats before they could escalate into open conflict. As months passed, Caesar's role evolved. He was no longer merely a victorious general or a celebrated statesman. His authority now encompassed legislation, administration, and military command simultaneously. He held the titles of consul and dictator, blending traditional offices with unprecedented personal influence. This concentration of power, though controversial, was framed as a necessary step to secure the Republic from internal decay and external threats. Rome itself adapted to Caesar's leadership. Citizens witnessed improvements in public services, infrastructure projects, and the provisioning of grain. The army, disciplined and loyal, continued to secure borders and suppress uprisings. Within the city, political debate persisted. But the risk of violent factionalism diminished as Caesar's presence symbolized both authority and protection. By consolidating power through careful reform, strategic military oversight, and administrative competence, Caesar transformed Rome from a city fractured by civil war into a functioning center of governance. His leadership was defined by the seamless integration of force, policy, and public perception, a model that would influence leaders for generations. The return to Rome and subsequent dictatorship marked not the end of Caesar's ambitions, but the beginning of a new phase, one in which his vision for Rome combining military mastery, political acumen, and social reform would be tested across the Republic and beyond. The stage was set for further campaigns, deeper political entanglements, and decisions that would shape the destiny of Rome for decades to come. As Julius Caesar's authority in Rome solidified, tension simmered beneath the surface. While many citizens and soldiers admired him for his victories and reforms, the Senate's traditionalist faction, the Optimates, viewed his growing power with suspicion and fear. To them, the Republic's ancient institutions seemed under threat, and Caesar's unprecedented accumulation of titles and influence was an affront to centuries of political tradition. The events leading up to the Ides of March were the culmination of years of rivalry, distrust, and political maneuvering. Senators, once allies, whispered conspiracies in shadowed corridors. Ambitious patricians feared that Caesar intended to transform Rome from a republic governed by elected officials into a state dominated by a single ruler. For them, resistance was not merely political, it was a matter of survival for their principles and way of life. Despite the rising hostility, Caesar moved carefully, aware of the delicate balance he needed to maintain. He continued his public reforms, maintained the loyalty of his legions, and cultivated support among the urban populace. Every appearance, every speech, was crafted to reinforce his image as a stabilizing force rather than a tyrant. Yet even the most meticulous measures could not fully prevent the scheming that had begun within the Senate walls. The conspirators, numbering over 60, plotted with meticulous care. Brutus, Cassius, and other leading senators each had personal grievances, political ambitions, or genuine concern for the Republic's institutions. They met in secret, coordinating a plan that would culminate in Caesar's assassination. Their strategy relied on timing, secrecy, and the manipulation of the Senate's traditions, knowing that Caesar would appear on the Ides of March, as was customary for political proceedings. On that fateful day, Caesar approached the theater of Pompey with calm and dignity. The air in the Senate was thick with anticipation, yet outwardly, everything appeared normal. The conspirators surrounded him, and in a swift, brutal sequence, Caesar was struck down. The shock reverberated through the Senate chamber and across Rome. Citizens, soldiers, and politicians alike were stunned, witnessing the sudden and violent culmination of years of tension. The assassination, however, did not restore the Republic in the way the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it unleashed a new wave of uncertainty and civil conflict. Caesar's supporters, deeply loyal to him both for personal admiration and the tangible reforms he had enacted, refused to yield to the conspirators' authority. The ensuing chaos drew Rome into a renewed civil war, pitting former allies against one another and reshaping the political landscape once again. In the immediate aftermath, Mark Antony, a close ally and general under Caesar, emerged as a central figure, rallying Caesar's veterans and leveraging the public's outrage. The balance of power shifted rapidly as alliances formed and dissolved. Battles erupted across Italy, and the memory of Caesar's reforms and victories became a rallying point for his followers. The Ides of March served as a stark lesson in the fragility of political power, even for the most accomplished and revered leaders. Caesar's rise and fall highlighted the interplay of military skill, political acumen, and public perception. Though his life was cut short, the legacy of his leadership, his campaigns, reforms, and vision for Rome continued to shape the Republic and the emerging foundations of the empire. Through the shockwaves of his assassination, Rome faced both devastation and opportunity. The civil war that followed would test the loyalty of legions, the resilience of cities, and the strategic foresight of those seeking to claim power. Caesar's story, from his crossing of the Rubicon to his final moments on the Ides of March, became a defining chapter in Roman history, illustrating the delicate balance between ambition, loyalty, and the institutions designed to contain both. The death of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it transformed the trajectory of Rome's political and social evolution. Though the Republic had endured for centuries with its complex balance of magistrates, Senate decrees, and civic institutions, the vacuum left by Caesar's assassination illuminated both the fragility and adaptability of Roman governance. His reforms, military victories, and vision for Rome's expansion created a foundation that would reverberate across generations. In the immediate aftermath, Rome experienced turbulence, civil unrest, armed confrontations, and political machinations dominated the city. Yet within this chaos, the principles Caesar had championed: the loyalty of legions, the respect for administrative efficiency, and the appeal to the common populace remained guiding forces. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, his adopted heir, emerged as central figures in stabilizing and directing the Republic toward new political structures. Caesar's vision for governance had been a delicate balance of innovation and respect for tradition. He had understood that Rome's strength lay not merely in military conquest, but in the ability to integrate conquered territories, manage resources, and maintain public order. His reforms in the provinces, appointing capable governors, standardizing taxation, and promoting local autonomy under Roman oversight, were as critical as the legions that secured borders. These structural changes allowed Rome to sustain far-reaching influence without overextending itself militarily, setting the stage for the empire to emerge from the Republic's ashes. The symbolic power of Caesar's legacy was equally significant. Public works, infrastructure projects, and social programs elevated the standard of life for many citizens, creating tangible reminders of effective leadership. Roads, aqueducts, and administrative offices facilitated not only commerce and governance, but also loyalty. As citizens recognized the benefits of an organized and attentive state, the urban landscape itself became a testament to Caesar's vision of a Rome that was both grand in ambition and practical in implementation. Octavian, later known as Augustus, inherited this complex legacy, and like Caesar, whose genius combined military brilliance with political acumen. Octavian faced the dual challenge of legitimizing his authority while navigating a Senate increasingly wary of concentrated power. Through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the cultivation of public support, he consolidated control, demonstrating that leadership required both vision and patience. The structures Caesar had implemented provided a blueprint: loyal legions, efficient administration, and citizen engagement were pillars upon which sustainable power could be built. Rome's transition from republic to empire was not abrupt but evolutionary, shaped by decades of civil war, social reform, and the steady consolidation of authority. Each campaign, each political maneuver, and each reform implemented under Caesar's leadership contributed to this transformation. The empire's rise was facilitated by the precedent of centralized authority exercised judiciously, tempered by administrative competence and respect for Roman traditions. The long-term impact of Caesar's campaigns extended beyond politics and governance. Military innovations, logistical strategies, and organizational principles developed under his command influenced subsequent generations of Roman generals. His campaigns in Gaul, Hispania, Greece, and Egypt demonstrated the value of adaptability, intelligence gathering, and integration of local knowledge into strategic planning. These lessons were institutionalized within the Roman military, ensuring that legions remained disciplined, effective, and capable of rapid response across vast territories. Culturally, Caesar's influence permeated Roman society. Festivals, public speeches, and civic rituals were designed not merely as ceremonial observances but as instruments to reinforce unity, loyalty, and identity. Citizens internalized the idea of a Rome that combined military excellence with civic responsibility, a society in which leadership was both accountable and visionary. The narrative of Caesar's life, his victories, reforms, and even his assassination became embedded in the collective consciousness, shaping the expectations of governance for generations. Economic stability and growth were also hallmarks of Caesar's legacy. By reorganizing taxation, promoting trade networks, and supporting agricultural development, he ensured that Rome's prosperity was not confined to the elite but extended to broader segments of society. Grain distributions, land reforms, and investments in infrastructure stabilized the urban population and mitigated social unrest, demonstrating that power exercised wisely could generate both loyalty and long-term stability. As Octavian and subsequent leaders consolidated power, the principles established under Caesar guided their approach. The empire's administration, military organization, and cultural identity were all informed by precedents he had set. Rome's ability to project authority over distant provinces, maintain internal order, and cultivate civic loyalty owed much to the reforms and vision introduced during Caesar's lifetime. Historians such as Suetonius and Plutarch chronicled these events, providing detailed accounts of Caesar's campaigns, governance, and personal qualities. Their writings ensured that the lessons of his life were preserved, offering insight into the interplay between individual leadership, institutional structures, and societal dynamics. The reliability of these sources, corroborated by archaeological evidence and contemporary records, underlines the enduring impact of Caesar's life and actions. In sum, Julius Caesar's legacy was not a simple tale of conquest or personal ambition. It was the foundation for Rome's transformation, a blueprint for governance, military strategy, and societal organization that allowed the Republic to evolve into an empire. His life demonstrated the necessity of vision, discipline, and adaptability, and the events following his assassination highlighted the fragile but resilient nature of political institutions. Through these achievements, Caesar ensured that his influence would persist long after his death, shaping the trajectory of Rome and leaving a mark on history that remains unparalleled. As the dust of civil war settled, and the echoes of political upheaval reverberated through the streets of Rome, the city began to breathe in a new rhythm. Julius Caesar's life and untimely death had altered the course of history irrevocably, setting the stage for a transformation that would redefine governance, military strategy, and social order. The republic that had endured centuries of internal strife now stood at the threshold of an empire, guided by the lessons and legacies left by its most famous general. The transformation of Rome was not an abrupt collapse of institutions, but rather an evolution, shaped by human ambition, military innovation, and political foresight. Caesar's campaigns had demonstrated the critical importance of disciplined armies, logistical planning, and the integration of local knowledge into broader strategic objectives. These principles did not vanish with his death. They became embedded in Roman military doctrine, influencing generations of commanders who would later secure and expand the empire's borders. Equally important was the transformation of civil governance. The reforms Caesar implemented, from provincial administration to taxation and public works, created a blueprint for effective centralized control while maintaining a connection with the citizenry. These administrative structures allowed Rome to project power efficiently, manage resources, and cultivate loyalty without relying solely on military might. Aqueducts and civic buildings were more than infrastructure, they were tangible symbols of a society capable of combining organization with ambition, efficiency with grandeur. The social fabric of Rome was also reshaped. Citizens, soldiers, and provincial communities had experienced the tangible benefits of leadership that balanced authority with responsiveness. Grain distributions, land reforms, and public programs created a sense of inclusion and stability, bridging gaps between elite and commoner, center and periphery. This social cohesion, though imperfect, provided a foundation upon which the empire could rise. Loyalty was no longer enforced merely through fear or coercion. It was cultivated through tangible improvements in daily life and governance. Octavian, who would become Augustus, inherited a Rome that had been tested by civil war, political rivalry, and personal ambition. Yet the structures and precedents established under Caesar offered him a map for navigating power with precision, by respecting traditions while consolidating authority. Octavian demonstrated that effective leadership required patience, strategy, and the ability to integrate multiple dimensions of control: military, administrative, and cultural. His reign marked the formal beginning of the Roman Empire, but its foundations were undeniably shaped by Caesar's vision and achievements. The interplay between military power and civic responsibility remains central to this transformation. Rome's legions were disciplined, organized, and loyal. Yet they were also part of a broader societal framework in which governance, infrastructure, and public services reinforced the authority of leaders. Caesar had exemplified this balance, showing that conquest alone could not secure lasting stability. Strategic administration, public engagement, and symbolic acts of authority were equally vital in maintaining cohesion and loyalty across vast territories. Culturally, the legacy of Caesar's Rome endured through festivals, public ceremonies, literature, and historical records. Citizens internalized narratives that celebrated military valor, civic responsibility, and the vision of a unified Rome. The stories of campaigns in Gaul, Egypt, and across the Mediterranean, as well as the dramatic events of the Ides of March, became part of the collective memory. These narratives shaped expectations of leadership, illustrating both the potential for greatness and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The transition from republic to empire also reflected the adaptive capacity of Roman institutions. While the Senate's authority diminished in practical terms, its symbolic role persisted, providing continuity amid transformation. Legal frameworks, civic rituals, and administrative offices evolved to accommodate centralized leadership without entirely discarding the traditions that had sustained Rome for centuries. This adaptability became a hallmark of Roman governance, allowing it to endure across vast territories and diverse populations. Economically, the foundations laid under Caesar and extended by Augustus facilitated long-term stability. Trade networks expanded, agricultural production was organized and optimized, and taxation policies became more predictable. These measures allowed the Roman state to sustain its military apparatus, support urban populations, and invest in public works that reinforced social cohesion. The material benefits of effective governance reinforced loyalty, creating a positive feedback loop that strengthened the empire's internal stability. Reflecting on this transformation, it becomes evident that Rome's evolution was neither inevitable nor simple. It was the product of vision, ambition, strategy, and adaptability. Leaders like Caesar and Augustus understood the interconnectedness of military, political, and social forces. Their ability to harmonize these dimensions determined not only their personal success but the enduring power of Rome itself. The Republic's collapse and the Empire's rise were not solely consequences of ambition or conflict. They were the outcome of thoughtful, deliberate adaptation to challenges and opportunities. Guided by the experiences of conquest, governance, and societal management. Historians such as Suetonius, Plutarch, Appian, and Cassius Dio provide extensive accounts of these events, offering insight into both the strategies employed and the human dimensions of leadership. These sources, corroborated by archaeological evidence and contemporary records, allow us to reconstruct the mechanisms by which Rome transformed. They highlight the delicate balance between individual agency and institutional structures, illustrating how Caesar's personal genius could shape the destiny of a city, a republic, and eventually an empire. Ultimately, the story of Rome's transformation is a testament to the enduring principles of leadership and governance. Vision, discipline, adaptability, and attention to the welfare of citizens were essential components of stability and expansion. Caesar's life and death, and the subsequent rise of Augustus, exemplify the intricate interplay between ambition and responsibility, illustrating how historical actors could navigate the tensions between personal power, public service, and institutional legacy. As we conclude this narrative, the lessons of Rome resonate beyond their historical moment. They remind us that political structures are living systems shaped by human choices, strategic insight, and social dynamics. The rise of the Roman Empire, emerging from the Republic's challenges, underscores the enduring significance of careful leadership, thoughtful reform, and the integration of military, administrative, and cultural dimensions into a cohesive framework. In this way, Julius Caesar's life, achievements, and even his tragic end become not just a historical record, but a guide for understanding the complex processes by which societies transform, endure, and flourish.